This is Dr. Kraus, and this is a brief video on some of the geographic locations that we feel are important for the study of the New Testament. And this is for the class BIB 1225, History and Literature of the Early Christians. So I'm going to do another one of these videos, but this one is kind of a broad view of the Roman world and the important cities for the Roman world. When we look at this, what we call the Roman world or the Roman Empire is surrounding the Mediterranean Sea. And the term Mediterranean just means middle of the earth. For them, this was everything. They thought more of the sea and the land surrounding it than the sea being enclosed by these lands. The Mediterranean Sea has some unique characteristics. It is relatively shallow, and so it stays pretty warm. It doesn't get terribly cold. It also doesn't really have tides. So whereas in the Atlantic Ocean you might get tides of 8, 10, 12 feet even varying in a day, you don't have that hardly at all in the Mediterranean Sea because it's enclosed and it it just doesn't do that. It's just a modern picture of a little town in Italy, and you can see that the coast of the Mediterranean Sea is often like this, very rocky, not not very lush in its forests and stuff. And sometimes they would just have to build a village right up the side of the mountain, like you see this. But very beautiful place. In the Mediterranean climate, it never gets really cold. It doesn't get super hot for the most part. But because of that, they had kind of an outdoor culture and still do. So homes would be constructed that basically had outdoor rooms, like living on your patio or your deck. And this was almost year round. You could do this, unlike what we get in Nebraska. So just a view of some of the cities now, and the first one I want to look at is Alexandria, which is the chief city, the capital city of Egypt. Now, Alexandria was not an ancient city, however, at this time. It had been founded by Alexander the Great about 300 years before the time of Christ. And you can see on this map, just to the south of it, Memphis, which was one of the ancient cities, maybe a couple thousand years older than Alexandria. But Alexander the Great had founded this after he conquered Egypt. So even though it was in Egypt, it was more of a Greek city coming from Alexander, and the rulers of Egypt at this time, even the pharaohs, the Ptolemies, the house of Ptolemy, they were really Greeks more than Egyptian, even though they had adopted a lot of the Egyptian style of life and called themselves pharaohs and stuff like that. And we mentioned in class the last of these was a queen pharaoh, and she is called Cleopatra. The city was founded strategically by Alexander the Great to have a very secure port where ships would survive a storm and not be beat up and crushed against the rocks. It also had this colossal lighthouse just outside the harbor. This is one author or one artist's view of what this might have looked like. And this was really a magnificent building that was considered one of the wonders of the ancient world. So Alexandria was important because it had a very large Jewish community. The city was maybe as large as 1 million people, probably the second largest city in the empire next to Rome itself. And doesn't directly impact the New Testament in that nobody visits there in the book of Acts, but lots of influence comes out of Alexandria. This is the place that the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, was translated into Greek and taken to Jerusalem, what we call the Septuagint. That is the version of the Old Testament that's used by the New Testament authors. So secondly, Jerusalem and this is the chief city, the province of Judea. We've said a lot about it before. It's known as the Temple City, and at the time of Jesus and Paul, this was the temple of Herod that had rebuilt the older temple, the second temple of Zerubbabel. Was surely one of the most magnificent buildings in the ancient world. There are descriptions of it that just overflow with how beautiful this temple was. In AD 70, however, the Jews had revolted and Jerusalem was destroyed, and the temple was destroyed by the Romans because of the rebellion and has never been rebuilt. But this is looking at the temple from the west, and the rise that you see on the other side of the temple is the Mount of Olives. A third city, or number 4 on our list, is Antioch, about 500 miles north of Jerusalem, but a very important Roman city and administrative center. This had also been founded by one of Alexander the Great's generals, actually, Antiochus, and it was the head city for the province of Syria. And the Roman person, the legate in Antioch, would have had ultimate control over what happened in Judea, in Jerusalem. We know that very early this city has a church, and a very important church. It's the one from where Barnabas and Paul go out as missionaries. So the first missionary journey recorded in Acts chapter 13. The city is pretty much abandoned now, but it was on this famous river, the Orontes River, and was a supposedly really delightful place to live, wonderful climate, pretty wealthy city, and very prosperous for all the people there, and well known in the ancient world, very influential both for the Roman Empire but also for the early church, becomes a Christian center. Number 5 on our list is Ephesus. Ephesus is the chief city in the province of Asia. Now later the term Asia gets applied to the entire continent behind it, but at this time it was a Roman province. Ephesus was the main city. Really becomes a Christian center in the early church, maybe the most important Christian city for a while in the 2nd century, at the end of the 1st century. Paul founds the church there, but other people work in this church that we know, including later the Apostle John, who makes his way to Ephesus. Ephesus was especially known for its temple to Diana, the fabulous, or more properly, the temple to Artemis, the one of the goddesses of the Greeks, and it was a gigantic, huge temple that made it kind of a center of tourism almost in the city of Ephesus, but very important city tied to a lot of books in the New Testament. I want to look briefly at Athens. Athens was a very famous city, city of learning, kind of like the Oxford, Cambridge, Harvard, all combined city of the ancient world. Paul visits Athens, and he goes to a place where all the philosophers are, called the Areopagus, which is not, this is not it, but very close to it. And this is their Acropolis, and you see in the background the fabulous temple that we call the Parthenon, to the goddess Athena. Parthenon, or Parthenos in Greek, means virgin. Athena was considered the great virgin goddess, so that's where the name comes from. The ruins of this Acropolis are still there today, and heavy tourist attraction, and actually in pretty good shape. There were a lot of other things on the Acropolis besides the Parthenon, but Athens had a great history politically, even militarily for a while, but at this time had become a center of religion and of learning. To the south and a little bit to the west of Athens is the city of Corinth, and we'll talk more about this when we get to it in class. But Corinth was probably a larger city than Athens at this time, but much more of a commercial city, and not didn't have a great reputation, uh, but was an administrative center and a source of wealth for the Romans. This is a picture of the modern ruins of Corinth, the temple to Apollo here in the foreground, the big pillars. And in the background, you see their Acropolis, which is removed from the city by a couple of miles. But on the top of that, they had a temple and also was fortified. They could go up there if they needed to withstand an invading army. But very important city. Paul founds the church in Corinth and uses it as a place to do ministry in other cities and as a place where he stops a couple of times. This is where he writes the letter to the Romans. What we call the book of Romans is written in the city of Corinth by Paul. And then finally, the most important city in the empire obviously is Rome, the largest city, maybe as many as 2 million people, somewhere between 1 and 2 million people, which is just enormous in the ancient world. All the logistics that you have of getting water to people on a daily basis, of getting rid of all the garbage, all the horse manure, I mean, it's just hard to have a big city. And they managed to do this in Rome. It was a magnificent city, and it was the source of all authority, but also the empire was designed that the wealth of the empire would flow back to Rome. So just enormously wealthy city. The wealth of the senators and the rich people in Rome is just almost beyond our comprehension. This is just a view of the forum, a reconstruction of the forum. They're having some ceremony here. The fabulous buildings in Rome were colossal in size and meant to intimidate people, but a city with a really long and glorious history and figures strongly into the New Testament. And this is where Peter and Paul both eventually die as martyrs for the church, and also eventually becomes the most important city in Christianity and still very important today, the center of the Roman Catholic Church, and the Vatican is in Rome, where the Pope resides today. So that's just this brief video and gives you a taste of these cities in the Roman Empire.